Good evening. Welcome to my new series and my Thursday night Bible study. I'm starting just about a minute late, and I'm also kind of trying to follow what goes on here on YouTube. I'm not entirely used to the way the YouTube streaming works. This is the Google Hangouts on Air form, but I want to activate the live chat. Streaming. I want to activate the live chat for you, and I haven't quite seen how to do that. So for the moment, we're kind of stuck. I know how to do it with when I'm streaming from the streaming software, but using the Hangouts on Air version, I don't. So we'll just have to live with that tonight. I'm going to spend tonight giving us an introduction to what's going to be going on with this particular session. I will be putting a link into the video at about this point as soon as it's ready to my interview this morning with Dr. Bruce Epperly. Dr. Bruce Epperly is the author of the Energeon Publications Participatory Study Guide to Galatians, and that is going to be the book that I'm using. However, I'm going to be interviewing several different Energeon authors with different perspectives on Paul. One of the questions is, what literature are they going to use? And we have variation from the minimum list of genuine Pauline epistles all the way to an author who includes the book of Hebrews. So we're going to have that full range. What was Paul like as a person? What was he like as a theologian? And so I will be, like I said, adding that. I'll be adding a link into this video to that interview, which will be a help to getting us started. Now, as we get going here, let's invite the Lord to be with us. Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the Apostle Paul and for his writings, and I pray that you will guide this study each week and all of the material that we gather in between. Let your Spirit speak. Let us each hear your voice in the name of Jesus. Amen. Now, one of the questions that I'm going to be asking all of the authors, and this one question forms the foundation, although I have many other questions that I ask them to build an overall picture. But a foundational question is, what are the sources of Paul's theology? And that is going to be the opening question and really the foundation question that will go all the way through. I'm going to be following Bruce Epperly's study guide to Galatians as the kind of outline. But as I go through Galatians, asking who Paul was, as I go through that study material, I'm going to be drawing on a large number of other sources. So we're going to, and let's distinguish here the sources that I'm drawing on versus the sources that we're talking about Paul drawing on. I will be drawing on especially Dr. Harold Weiss's book, Meditations on the Letters of Paul, also published by Energeon Publications. And I will point out that on Energeon Direct, and you can find this on my website on energeondirect.com. Right now, both of those study guides are on sale. And it would be probably very valuable if you're going to follow this study for you to have copies of those study guide of the study guide and also Harold Weiss's book. Now, I am going to, in addition, look at material outside of what Dr. Weiss and Dr. Epperly consider the genuine Pauline epistles. In the interview that I had with Dr. Epperly today, he lists the same list as Dr. Weiss does in Meditations on the Letters of Paul. That is the list that is the generally agreed upon list of genuine letters. Those are Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Philippians, Philemon. Trying to do these in Galatians. Trying to do these without looking at notes is a little bit difficult. But then we have a certain number of disputed epistles, Colossians and Ephesians. Second Thessalonians fall into the category of very substantially disputed epistles. And in this case, our Energeon authors, and this includes people that I'm going to be interviewing with the question, who was Paul, such as Dr. Alan Bevere, his participatory study guide to Colossians and Philemon. He maintains Pauline authorship of Colossians, which is a disputed epistle. Ephesians, Dr. Bob Cornwall wrote our participatory study guide to that, and Dr. Cornwall takes the other line, probably both on Ephesians and Colossians. I'm certainly going to ask him about that when I interview him. But he sees Ephesians as not genuinely Pauline. And so then beyond those that I would call disputed, there's the pastoral letters, where there's a fairly strong consensus that Paul didn't write the pastoral epistles, that these were written by a disciple, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. So many authors who might accept both Ephesians, Colossians, and actually also accept 2nd Thessalonians as Pauline epistles might yet reject the pastoral epistles. And finally, in the greatest dispute is the book of Hebrews, which the vast majority of scholars hold that Hebrews is not a genuine epistle of Paul. And the fact is, of course, that Hebrews itself does not claim to be written by Paul. It does not identify the author, which is one of the things that I consider a very strong indication. It seems to me unlikely that if it was in fact a letter of Paul, that it would not be identified. And that's why, despite I give greater credence to the evidence that that Hebrews might have been written by Paul, nonetheless, I do not find it finally convincing. But nonetheless, we will be interviewing Dr. David Alan Black, who is author of, again, it's an Energeon title, actually the first volume in our Topical Line Drive series, titled The Authorship of Hebrews, The Case for Paul, in which he does some very serious scholarly argumentation in favor of Paul as the author. And in most of the cases where I have read counter arguments, they don't match up quite to that. Like I said, I remain unconvinced for my own reasons, but nonetheless, this is worth considering. Now, there's a couple of different approaches that we could take. One is to say, I could tell you what I think was written by Paul, and I've only expressed my own view to this point on the book of Hebrews. Although I'll tell you, I certainly do not dispute the generally undisputed Pauline epistles. But that is not exactly the approach that I'm planning to take. Rather, because I'm going to be looking at the background, what went into building Paul's theology. And so at the same time, we're going to have to ask, what literature are we going to allow to work in here? And I am going to look at the specific theological points of some of these books. So as I do Galatians, we can take a comparison, for example, to Romans, and then in a comparison in turn to Ephesians and Colossians in particular, let's say when we're talking about soteriology, talking about salvation. So, and say, why is it that the differences between Galatians and Romans are within the range that we might see as likely for a single author? And what is it about the theological propositions of Colossians and Ephesians that sound to many theologians as though this was written by somebody else, written by a later disciple? And To take the more extreme case, then we can add in the book of Hebrews and say why there are certainly compatible points between these various documents. But what is it in the differences? And in looking at those fine gradations, those fine differentiations of the theology, I think we'll get an idea, first of all, of how to look at authorship from a theological point of view. And I will bring in vocabulary and so on, but I'm going to be more into building the theology. How does that work? And then allow that to illuminate our own view of Paul. So at the end of this, I'm more interested in anybody who follows through this video series being able to state what literature you're going to accept as genuine and what kind of a picture that gives you of Paul. Now, one of the interesting things, again, and I urge you to watch my interview with Bruce Epperly, is that even though Bruce does not accept the pastoral epistles as genuine Pauline, he does not reject them as material to preach from. And that's true of the majority of people of Christian pastors, biblical interpreters. They're not saying when they say this wasn't written by Paul that this is a bad book, especially the book of Hebrews. For many people, the book of Hebrews is, and this is true for me, that the book of Hebrews is a key element of Christian theology, and yet we don't believe that it was written by Paul, as part, at least, of the apostolic tradition would hold. And so looking at the letter, we don't think Paul wrote it. At the same time, we think it's great theology. Dr. Bruce Epperly doesn't see that certain aspects of the pastoral epistles, and this is something that it may be good to ask him to expand on at some point, really change the picture of Paul. He talks about Paul's attitude toward women, and in the way that he is reading Paul, in the way that he is understanding, he's less concerned with it. He also mentions the book of James and his book, Holistic Spirituality, which is built on the book of James, in which he thinks James and Paul are not actually so far apart. He thinks that James is disputing not Paul, but Paul's followers. And so these kinds of issues we're going to look at. But the way we're going to look at them is by looking at the background. Now, I am much more equipped to talk to you about Paul's background than I am actually talking directly about the New Testament epistles. I'm going to be depending heavily on my sources and on these additional interviews that I will be having with Energeon authors, asking that question, who was Paul? So it will be important to follow those. Now note that unlike the previous sessions, I'm not going to be doing hour-long sessions, but I am planning to do some supplementary both videos, such as these interviews, and also blog posts to back up. Sometimes some of the details are easier to do in writing, at least for me, than they are on the video. So what I'm going to look at here is, where did Paul's basic theology come from? And that's got to look at two steps. Paul is raised as a Jew of the first century, and particularly a diaspora Jew, which is a Jew who was raised not in Judea, but in Anatolia, in modern Turkey, Paul of Tarsus. Now, Paul also, according to everything that we know from these documents, was thoroughly trained. He had rabbinic training. He had studied Judaism a great deal. So we're going to look here at a couple of things. In my blog post announcing this, I distinguish Israelite religion from Judaism. There's a difference between, say, modern Judaism, first century Judaism, and the Israelite religion from which it arose. As a matter of fact, some of the disputes of first century Israelite practice result in Judaism. Sadducees were largely connected to the temple. Pharisees were not so connected to the temple. They were not the ruling elite. And for them, the Torah in their interpretation of it, even though they accepted the prophets and the writings, whereas the Sadducees did not, nonetheless, for them, Torah was more central to everybody's spiritual life, whereas for the Sadducees, well, the Torah is what tells you how to do it. It's the temple worship. It's the temple sacrifices and rituals that is the center of worship. So it's perhaps not hard to understand that the Sadducees did not really survive the end of the Judean War. When the temple is destroyed in AD 70, the Pharisees, who had already placed their focus on the law and on the practice of the law, were able to move away from a Judaism that required there to be a temple. Whereas for the Sadducees, with worship centering not in the text and in the reading, hearing of the text, and in the practice of the text, this ethical practice, would have a much easier time separating themselves. So to ask the question here, where does Paul get his background? You have these two elements, this background of Israelite religion, a background of direct reading of the Hebrew scriptures, which in Christian parlance then become the Old Testament. But remember that when Paul is doing it, that is the Bible still for Christians and for Jews. The same set of what we now distinguish by calling them Hebrew scriptures were just the scriptures when Paul was writing. So we have this direct study of the scriptures as your source. You have the traditions in Judaism, and assuming that Paul, it's his historical idea that Paul was trained by Gamaliel, he would have been trained in the Pharisaic tradition. And at least the fact that he is trained in the Pharisaic tradition is a fairly solid background. So he has started already with a certain amount of separation from the temple ritual. Now, when I say this, don't imagine that the Pharisees are a group that completely reject the idea of the temple or the importance of this kind of activity. And the Sadducees reject everything about the text. Rather, it's an emphasis that when it meets this barrier of the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees' emphasis was not able to carry them forward, whereas the Pharisees was. Now, Paul has this Pharisaic training, a familiarity with the temple ritual and with the temple hierarchy for which he worked, working against Christianity. And so you have all of that combination in that background. But it's not quite as simple as even that, because he's also growing up in a world where Greek thought is coming into play, and we clearly see a background of Greek philosophy, Greek reading, Greek thinking in Paul's writings and in what's written about him in Acts. By the way, that's another question that I'll be asking each of the people I interview on Paul is, what weight do you give the book of Acts as historical source on the Apostle Paul. And there is a variation amongst scholars as to what they take there. But the book of Acts increases our understanding of Paul as somebody with a proto-Western, a Western background in terms of Greek philosophy. And so we ask the question then, of course, how much of this Greek philosophical background, how much of the nature of Roman law, and how much of Judaism, how much of Israelite religion, both mediated through Judaism and the Pharisaic tradition and mediated or taken more directly from Scripture. How much did this feed into Paul's understanding? This is the sort of question I want to ask. And as we go through Galatians, then as Galatians brings a theological point, not only will we look at Galatians, but I will look at these other sources. And so each lesson is probably going to take multiple weeks. If you don't want to dig deeply into Paul and Paul's background, this is probably not the series for you. It's because I'm going to be spending a good deal of time. How does this play out in Galatians? How does it play out in Romans? And then comparing it to also to Colossians, Ephesians, in terms of and then of how it is expressed, how the theology is laid out and developed, so that we can come to an understanding from all of that, of how these sources relate. And it's in understanding that I think individuals can make informed decisions as to whether to view these disputed epistles as Pauline or not. So that's going to be that's the purpose. That's the purpose of the study and the way I'm going to proceed. Now, in Meditations on the Letters of Paul, Harold Weiss has discussed the Pauline material topically. So he looks through all of what he regards as the genuine letters of Paul and discusses how Paul looks at the topic. So understand that once we go through the study of the particular topic in Galatians itself, and through the Dr. Bruce Epperly's study guide to Galatians, then we're going to turn to a lot of the material that Dr. Weiss is presenting, which is looking at how does this play out throughout the writings of Paul. And so, as you can see, this will take some time because I don't want to brush over any of this lightly. I will try to keep this moving forward a bit by means of blog posts as we're going through. And also I'm going to try to avoid reiterating everything that Bruce Epperly has to say in his study guide. Seeing as we have the study guide as the starting point, I'm hoping that we'll be able to simply take for granted what's in there, even to whatever extent, even if to some extent we may be disagreeing with it, but we'll take for granted that it's been studied. Again, it's not going to be very profitable to follow this study through without actually reading the texts. And I'm going to put it to you this way. In this process, I'm going to be rereading every one of these texts from Romans on through Hebrews. I'm going to be re-looking at them, and that's an important element of this study. Now, before I say what reading would be the basis for starting next week, I'm going to ask I want to comment on why I'm using Dr. Epperly's study guide in particular. One of the purposes of the participatory study series that I started is to present people with different approaches to reading and understanding Scripture from serious practitioners who use that methodology and on a serious level, as in an entire book. Dr. Epperly has written 2 study guides, Philippians and Galatians. These come from the point of view of a progressive theologian. Again, in his interview, he talks about why, he finds Paul such a sympathetic person and personality when many progressive theologians don't. What I'm wanting here is to get us out of the rut of reading Galatians as, how shall I answer the theological questions of soteriology? It's one of the reasons why some people are kind of satisfied with reading the first 4 chapters of Galatians, which is what happened to me when I took a class in Galatians in seminary, is because we're interested in righteousness by faith, salvation by faith, sanctification, justification, all these kinds of terms that we bring in. And once we know what Paul is saying about those things, then we're happy. But we're not really allowing Paul himself to speak. What was the problem at the church in Galatia? How is Paul trying to resolve that problem? How effective do you think that resolution was? Let's listen for the personality. Let's listen for the whole theology, the ethics, the practice of ministry. Who was Paul and how was he doing this? And how did he get to that point? And I think Dr. Epperly is a good person to pull us directly out of the rut, to make us think differently about the letters of Paul. So, what I'm going to ask is, there's a section of preface in Dr. Epperly's preface is, and I'm looking at the pages here on my other screen, talks about a movement in the making. He's talking about early Christianity and how this fills in. And then the second part, called Becoming Galatians, Spiritual Practices for Reading Galatians. Now, that's an odd title for that, and some people may find it a little difficult to follow. But what Dr. Epperly is trying to get us to do here is bring Paul's experience and Paul's preaching and teaching and writing into our own spiritual lives. And so instead of just sitting here saying, who was Paul? He is asking us to try to live the experience, to say, what is this going to do for my spiritual life and my walk with God? If we could read those 2 before next week, those 2 sections, that would be extremely valuable, because I'll ask us to follow that along all the way through. This can be an extremely academic study, or as we go through and look at it and say, how did this develop? How is this? What was Paul's experience, and what would it have been like to converse with him on these issues? That we will get a new way, a new approach to understanding. So that's why I'm using his book as the background, as the backbone on Galatians, and then supplementing with Dr. Weiss's. Now, you might ask, since I want to cover all of these topical things, why not do Dr. Weiss's book? And the reason is, Dr. Epperly's book is more basic, more to the point, and you have this simple, straightforward structure through Galatians. Then we'll grab that anchor point as we go look around at all of the other material. I think that this is going to get us the best of both of these authors. And then as I bring in additional authors, note that many of these authors that I'm bringing in are also evangelical. This is not just a progressive or evangelical study. I want us to hear the voices, and from hearing the voices, bring this experience home. Note also, if you go back, and again, as I can't recommend this strongly enough, I really enjoyed interviewing Bruce about his understanding, but he talks about the sources. One of those is Paul's mysticism, starting on this Damascus Road experience, which is why I've used this clouds and lightning image as the header for the posts on this on my blog, so you'll be able to easily identify them. They'll have that dark sky and with clouds and the lightning bolt in it. Is this mystical God talking to us experience, and where I can guarantee to you here that Dr. Epperly and I both share a viewpoint, and that is that God is willing to speak to you. So we're not talking simply about the history of Paul's spiritual experience, but we're asking what in the experience of Paul can change our experience. Not just the writings of Paul, but getting to know Paul as a person who can tell us how to experience God. Now, that's a half an hour on this, and as I intended, I really haven't gone into any of the details, but that's just telling you what's coming up. And hopefully by the time we come next week, I'll have a second of these interviews. But as I said, I'll be putting that link to my interview with Bruce Epperly at the beginning of this video once it posts on YouTube, which usually takes about an hour. And hopefully by next week, I'll have resolved the issue with getting the live chat going. So for tonight, thanks for joining me. Hope to see you next week, or if you are choosing to watch the videos at some other time, that's fine as well. And God bless you.